Do you miss the days when budgets were boring? Rachel, do you want to kick us off? Major talking points? What were the headlines?
So I think the major headline is that pretty much everything in this budget had been heavily briefed beforehand. So if you had an idea of kind of what the budget was going to be this morning, most of it was confirmed. I think big news is tax rises of 26 billion over the course of the remaining years of the Parliament, which is big, which gives Rachel Reeves over double her fiscal headroom without having to pull one of those three tax levers. So we didn't get the increase in income tax that we thought we might be getting 2 weeks ago and then realised that we weren't getting. And so instead, that money is coming from a variety of tax sources, the biggest of which is continuing the Conservatives' freeze on tax thresholds. And then there are things like pay per mile road taxing for electric vehicles. There's the mansion tax that we've been talking about this week. There's the milkshake tax we've been talking about this week. Generally, all of those together add up to 26 billion. And then on the spending side, the thing that Labour MPs are going to be sort of having as their headline for the rest of this week and probably for the rest of this Parliament is cutting or getting rid of the two-child benefit cap, which was the last kind of big unveiling that Rachel Reeves did at the end of her speech. And there was jubilation in the chamber from the Labour benches. They were all sort of waving their order papers and cheering, and a real sense of elation on that point specifically.
You both have hot-footed it to the New Statesman's podcast studio from the parliamentary estate. So thank you for podcasting. George, let's talk about the two-child benefit cap then for a minute. I mean, this is going to make a real impact to child poverty, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Look, if there's any single measure you can take that will reduce child poverty more than any other, it's this one. The OBR forecasts that it will lift 450,000 children out of poverty by the end of the Parliament. But politically, it's controversial because polling shows 59% of the public back it, including most Labour voters. And so it will require Reeves and Starmer to do something they haven't been very good at so far, which is leading and winning arguments, which is to say that we think this is unjust. It's unjust that the benefits you receive are not linked to the size of your family. It's unjust that children are growing up in poverty, hindering their future opportunities. And I think she started to make that argument in her budget. She was fairly upfront about why she was doing it. And I think you saw that run through the whole budget. The big picture here is that Britain has become a significantly higher tax and spend country.
Yes.
And her first budget raised taxes and increased spending, but I think was more framed around the inheritance. And we inherited a mess. That's why taxes are going up. That's why spending we're prioritising particular public services. This time, I thought you saw her make a more overt social democratic argument, which is that we want to improve public services and everyone's going to have to contribute to do that. So even on the tax threshold, a classic stealth tax, she did make a more explicit argument. So I think we saw a more political Rachel Reeves today.
Let's talk about those tax thresholds then for a second. I mean, is it right to interpret this as a fudge to get around manifesto promises from the 2024 election? I was talking to Will Dunn just before we came down and started recording, and he was talking about these thresholds and the manner in which, I'm paraphrasing him, I think he said the proportion of people that are higher tax rate payers has doubled since the thresholds were introduced. And his argument, well, the joke he delivered in a typical Will Dunn way was, we will all eventually be higher tax rate payers because the thresholds will never move and eventually everyone's salaries, inflation, etc., will get there. Is it reductive to understand this as a kind of a manifesto get workaround? How should we interpret it, Rachel?
Well, firstly, on we're all going to be higher rate taxpayers soon. I think it's now 1 in 4 as a result of this, and the changes are going to mean 920,000 more people in the higher tax bracket. So like nearly 1 million people dragged into a bracket that they wouldn't otherwise have been in. And then on the revenue raising side, it's going to raise around 8 billion. So if you're thinking about how did Rachel Reeves manage to pull off that trick of raising more money and giving herself more headroom, this is the big ticket item. It's really interesting in terms of whether voters will notice this or how they will see it. So politicians of all parties tend to see freezing the thresholds as a stealth tax, a tax that voters probably won't notice. Interesting polling by More in Common before the budget showed that actually about half of people do see it as a manifesto breach because it is increasing taxes on working people. And that includes a high proportion of people who voted Labour in the last election. So the extent to which people actually buy the government line that it isn't a tax increase, debatable. Obviously, if there had been an income tax rise, that figure would probably have been 100%. So it depends which way you look at it. There's also an additional stealth tax on top of the stealth tax in terms of freezing the thresholds at which graduates start repaying their student loans for an extra 3 years. So if you are a graduate who took out a student loan, you're going to be affected by this twice in the sense that you might get dragged into a higher tax bracket, and also you're going to be paying more of your student loan back earlier, except that we know that because of the interest rates, most of them aren't going to pay it back in total. So it's really just a higher tax. And I think that might be one of the stories of this budget as it starts to maybe not unravel, but as we start to put it under the microscope a bit more, this kind of, are there certain groups that are going to be paying more tax as a result of this? Yes. Who are those groups? Workers on the cusp of that income tax threshold and graduates.
I remember interviewing Torsten Bell before he was in government, before he was an MP, actually, when he was chief executive of the Resolution Foundation, in the wake of one of the Tory budgets. And he was talking about fiscal drag as this kind of deeply nefarious sort of sinister force that impacts on the economy and impacts on people's purses, of course, now in the Treasury himself and as is widely reported, one of the key architects of the budget. I wonder, George, if you could give us a sense of the sort of high politics around the budget and how we ended up in this situation. Should we characterise it as tax and spend, as a more socialist, social democratic budget, and how do the various characters in the Treasury play into all of that?
Well, yeah, certainly. To reference Torsten Bell, when I interviewed him shortly before he became an MP, he said what he believes in bread and butter social democracy. That's what he thinks Britain needs. And this was very much bread and butter social democracy. It was quite reminiscent of the budgets that Gordon Brown gave in terms of prioritising child poverty, more money for the NHS, high taxes, but nothing as radical as the wealth tax that Zach Polanski and others on the left would want. So it's sort of solidly social democratic. The big political argument that will continue to run on is whether they should have raised income tax. And I think the argument that those who supported that policy would make is they thought it would reassure the markets, who have sort of reacted fairly neutrally, I think, to this budget. For so far, she has increased her fiscal headroom. And the other point they made is if you have the so-called smorgasbord of tax rises, the risk is that you alienate lots of different groups for not much revenue, and that if you have a broad-based tax rise, you're in a better position. Now, look, I think, as you suggest, she's basically gone for a broad-based tax rise, which is the threshold for it. She's raised serious amounts of money. It's about 8 billion. So we're talking large sums, and that allow her to say she hasn't broken the letter of the manifesto. Some will say it breaks the spirit because it's working people who will pay it. But that's the choice they made. And I think ultimately, this explanation for the Treasury that is all to do with the OBR forecast. I mean, if you read the OBR document, they're pretty clear that nothing dramatic changed between the earlier forecast and the later forecast. So it was the politics that drove this. It was Lucy Powell coming out and saying, I don't think you should break the manifesto. Wes Streeting hinting as much. Labour MPs likening it to the Lib Dems tuition fees pledge, notoriously broken under Nick Clegg. I think Reeves and Starmer, after all the trouble of number 10 view Wes Streeting, their disastrous poll ratings, just thought, look, do we really want to become a government that breaks its defining manifesto pledge at the budget? And decided, no, we don't.
I mean, there's a world in which you could characterise the council tax surcharge on properties over £2 million, the mansion tax. You could characterise that as a wealth tax, couldn't you? You could describe it as such.
Yeah, it was very interesting in the budget, and I think this is a riposte to the Greens. And I think the Greens, as well as quite an amusing joke by Rachel Reeves on Zach Polanski's.
Wasn't that funny? I'm sorry.
I thought it was quite good.
What was it? Come on.
So, as someone,
I'm going to let George explain this.
Zach Polanski has passed as a hypnotist and once claimed that he was capable of increasing the size of women's breasts. And today in the budget, Rachel Reeves, I think, said the only things that would get bigger under Zach Belansky would be inflation and the deficit.
Zing.
And now, what that tells you, and this has been a pattern of Labour politicians calling out the Greens in recent times. You look at the polling data, the Greens are now winning 20% of Labour's 2024 vote. It's more than any other party. So this is now a genuine electoral battle. They'll be looking to make massive gains against Labour in the May elections next year. So there's a sort of serious point there. And then I think on the policy front, Rachel Reeves ticked them off in her speech. She said, look, I've raised taxes on private equity, private schools, private jets. That's her saying, if you want a bit of populist, left populism, I've already given it to you.
Something else that came out of this More in Common pre-budget briefing that I think is worth mentioning in terms of why Rachel Reeves didn't go for an income tax increase, even though economists kind of across the political spectrum, left and right, would say that is the simplest, most straightforward and most successful way to raise the revenue that you need. In terms of how voters would view that, they tracked breaching the manifesto commitment on tax against other scandals like the Liz Truss mini budget and the Partygate scandal and the Lib Dems U-turning on tuition fees, and it was more unpopular than all of them. So had she done that, and I, from with my economics thinking hat on, that would have been a much more straightforward thing to do and much less risky in terms of alienating all these different groups and a bigger revenue raiser. But if you want to think why she didn't do it, if you think about what Partygate and the PPE scandal did to the Conservatives, and in voters' heads, this would have been even bigger, even more damaging. You can see why, having sort of laid the groundwork for it, she then backed away from it. And we're in this position now where the I can't pronounce it. I can spell it, but I can't pronounce it. Smorgasbord of little taxes that each individual one could unravel, but together you could just about make them add up in the way that she wants them to.
Should we talk a little bit about the OBR? should we pick up on the leaking of the entire budget before Rachel Reeves was on her feet, George?
Yeah, this, even by recent Westminster standards, is unprecedented. So this is the phrase. This is exactly what we didn't want to happen. Since the OBR was founded in 2010 by George Osborne, it's never happened. The forecast and this book are normally given to journalists at the end of the budget once the Chancellor sat down. And obviously the risk is that you've got market moving data in there. And I think the sense is that it obviously took some of the wind out of Rachel Reeves's sails. And she was sort of visibly furious at the dispatch box. I think you had immediately people speculating whether Richard Hughes, the OBR head, or maybe the institution itself would be for the chop. Treasury spokesman subsequently said, Chancellor has confidence in Richard Hughes, but that's going to be quite an inquiry now. I would err on the side of probably cock-up rather than conspiracy, but that's for the inquiry now. It
did change the mood in the chamber really quite radically. I've sat through quite a few budgets and fiscal statements and autumn statements and things, and what normally happens is while the Chancellor is speaking, the leader of the opposition is sort of furiously trying to write their speech kind of in real time because they're hearing about the measures as they're being announced. Obviously, Kemi Badenoch was trying to write her speech in real time, but with much, much, much longer to do it because she kind of had the entirety of PMQs and indeed like the budget speech itself, which went on for over an hour in order to do that. And she got handed a paper copy of the OBR report. Somebody had clearly dashed out of the chamber to grab it for her. And Mel Stride was sitting next to her, helping her annotate bits of it. And she was just getting a lot longer to put her statement together. And it changed the rhythm of it. It changed the dynamic of PMQs actually, because the OBR report landed just before PMQs. Kemi Badenoch got to launch off on that and her questions with Keir Starmer, which will be forgotten in the budget coverage, but it kind of meant she got to start on a quite energetic high. And two, just if you looked around the chamber from the gallery, MPs across like Labour benches, Tory benches were all just scrolling their phones trying to get ahead of it. So actually the attention on PMQs was very, very minimal. It was all on, hang on, we've got this huge document, what are we going to do with it? And I think that, opposition speeches on budget days tend not to get very much coverage, but I think it gave Kemi Badenoch a massive advantage. And in fairness to her, she managed to make use of that advantage.
Yeah, we'll talk about Kemi a little bit more in a second. Slight tangent. I thought it's worth. I'm not sure they should be allowed to be on their phones in the chamber. I think it cheapens the quality of debate, perhaps, if everyone's scrolling. But that's for a different time. Yeah, I guess typically at the PMQs before a budget, the Prime Minister deflects and says, you only have to wait half an hour. You will soon, please, dear Leader of the Opposition, we will tell you soon enough. But obviously, if you're the Leader of the Opposition, you're like, well, we've all got it now. So you've got absolutely no reason to not be talking to me. It could potentially make you look quite silly as the Prime Minister, can't it? George, let's talk about Kemi. Let's talk about her response. I think that's one of the better responses or speeches I've seen her give. I thought it was incredibly punchy.
Yeah, now look, obviously no other leader of the opposition has had the OBR document before, but in the sense that that does raise the bar, because I think then everyone will be looking to say she's missed an open goal. She can't win even with the biggest leak in budget history. No, she didn't miss an open goal, and I think her Commons performances have been improving for some weeks now. And I think the Conservatives feel that they've got quite a clear line of attack on the economy. They've always thought that's how there's a route back for them, because they thought if Labour are seen to run into real economic trouble, or if the voters simply think, look, you've just gone too far on tax to spend and we want a kind of political IMF to come in and sort it out. The Tories think they're the people who voters will look towards, because they think they'll look at reform and say, look, do we really trust these guys to make the sums add up? No, we don't. So that's been their strategy all along, and they'll hope that they're going to get some benefit.
In the world of IMF and structural adjustment plans, I quite like the idea of a Tory adjustment plan sort of being prescribed to the Labour government. You will have more fiscal conservatism. Okay, I want to dial in on the Badenoch response, and specifically the impression she did of Rachel Reeves, because I watched it on TV and my mouth sort of hit the floor as she started. She sort of like shaking her head, and like she elevated the pitch of her voice, and she was attacking Reeves for the sort of the headlines about mansplaining and misogyny. And we only saw very short cuts to Rachel Reeves, but when it did, she looked absolutely furious.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that moment.
Well, it was Kemi Badenoch went personal on it, and she is, her supporters would say, at her best with that kind of attack line. It was vicious. The point that she made about mansplaining, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it was something like people aren't criticising her because she's a woman, they're criticising her because she's incompetent. Now, I was thinking that is the kind of line that only a woman could have delivered to her. So if we talk about the gender dynamics of it, you've got the first female chancellor, a female leader of the opposition. That does change the way that conversation goes. Like, I couldn't imagine Mel Stride pulling off that kind of line. This has been one of Kemi Badenoch's key points that she's made sort of throughout her political career, that yes, she's a woman, yes, she's a black woman, but when other people make points about diversity or sexism or racism, she's there going, that's utterly ridiculous. I've never experienced any of it, in a way that she can because of who she is. And that kind of anti-identity politics has served her very well as part of her brand. It's not something that she's used much against Keir Starmer at PMQs, but you could see her kind of energised by the prospect of being able to use it against Rachel Reeves. And yeah, Reeves looked, at first I thought sort of dismayed by it, and then it kind of transitioned into absolute fury, especially because being the first female chancellor is a very important part of her brand. Whether it should be or not is up for debate.
One of the other lines, George, that Badenoch used, she called Reeves the worst chancellor ever. First of all, do you think that's true? Second of all, who else are the contenders for the title in your eyes?
It's become quite a competitive field, hasn't it? I mean, look, I think in a sense you would expect Kemi Badenoch to say that afterwards. She's the leader of the opposition. I think the problem for Rachel Reeves is that quite a lot of the public think that now. Her ratings are about as bad as Kwasi Kwarteng's were after the mini budget. That is a very bad political position to be in. Does she have any hope of recovery? But I think Labour strategists are hoping that this budget, in terms of the offers on living standards, on lower energy bills, £150, off, first freeze in rail fares for 30 years, lower NHS waiting lists, rising the minimum wage. That's all aimed at economically insecure target voters, the kind of people who they think will decide the next election. The risk, though, is that, I mean, some in Labour have basically concluded Starmer and Reeves have a reverse Midas touch, that even when there are policies that would normally be popular, they're unpopular when they're linked to them. And I think that is the question Labour is going to be wrestling with between now and the May elections. If they don't get any kind of boost from the budget, if things continue to get worse rather than better, then MPs, I mean, they're already asking, is this the team we want to go into those pivotal May elections with?
Rather than everything they turn to gold, everything they touch turns to...
Rubbish.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very, very good. Yeah. What do you think, Rachel? How does this affect the Chancellor's position? Has she been strengthened by the budget?
I think we'll have to wait for the next couple of days to see if bits and pieces unravel. In terms of, do her sums add up? Did she manage to sort of squeak through without breaking either the manifesto commitment or the fiscal rules? Yes, there is a bit of, in the OBR report that I was reading through PMQs, that made me go, oh, okay, which is sort of towards the end, they look at all the tax revenue raising measures, how much they're going to bring in, and then they rank them in certainty terms. And loads of them are either high uncertainty or very high uncertainty. So what you've got is spending commitments where you have a pretty good idea how much, say, scrapping the 2-child benefit cap is going to cost, and you've got revenue raisers like pay per mile for EVs, which is not going to come until 2029 anyway, or this mansion tax, or changes to gambling, increasing the tax on gambling, and all of those, like, they're going to raise some money. Do we know how much they're going to raise? It's a lot of, because they're behavioural, there's a lot of uncertainty in exactly how much money you can get from those. So if you're in a position where on paper everything adds up really neatly, but in reality people's behaviour changes, the situation changes, and those tax raising measures don't bring in as much revenue as you think they're going to, then you're back to square one and you're looking to do all of this again. And I think that is the overarching danger for her, that she's written a budget that looks on paper like it adds up but could end up unravelling.